Just wanted to give my random thoughts about the James Bond series. I know it's now owned by Amazon, I think, or Prime, whatever it is. Um, I think it's pretty much the end of the Bond era, though. It just feels like it, right? Even if somehow Amazon or Prime releases it as a movie series, is it just going to be on Prime now? I imagine it has to be released in theaters, but something feels different now, and I think it actually happened during the Daniel Craig series. But let me go back. I have been a fan of the James Bond series. Honestly, one of the earliest memories I have is some imagery from The Man with the Golden Gun. And that was like, when that movie was released, I would have been 3 years old. So I can't say it was in the theater, because there's no way I'd be able to remember at 3 years old, right? But it's certainly the first James Bond movie I ever saw. And so maybe it was on television, I don't know. But I certainly grew up with Roger Moore as Bond, because he was Bond for a very long time, and it would be my formative years watching him. And then, of course, I would go back and watch the Sean Connery Bond films. I watched the Timothy Dalton two films. Eventually saw the George Lazenby on Her Majesty's Secret Service. And then, of course, Pierce Brosnan, and then Daniel Craig. Full disclosure, no Bond film is perfect. I mean, they all have some sort of flaw. There are moments where most of them drag. Some of them have predictable, climaxes where they take place in a lair, the villain's lair, and things are exploding, and he has to rescue the girl, and there's a lot of things that are a bit stale when I watch some of these older Bond films. But still, there's a lot of fond memories of these Bond movies. So what I have to say is I feel like whatever your favorite Bond film is directly attached to whoever your favorite James Bond actor is. Because the truth of the matter is, each film takes on the personality of the actors playing Bond. So, in the case, now Sean Connery was the first, so obviously he put a major stamp on the character from the very beginning. Charming, tough, handsome, all of that. When Roger Moore took over, he was a cheekier Bond. He was, funnier, and he was lighter, and maybe not as convincing in the action, as convincing as Sean Connery in the action roles. And yes, his movies were fun, but the movies sort of took on the same thing. The sillier Roger Moore sometimes got, then the sillier the movies got. So by 1985, 86, whenever the last Roger Moore movie came out, I would have been about 14 or 15 years old. And even I was ready for a more mature Bond. I was ready for a more serious Bond. And a Bond who looked more convincing in the action. So I got Timothy Dalton in The Living Daylights. And then he would have a second film, License to Kill. And this is the Bond I wanted. I mean, he was rugged. He was handsome, but he had sharp features. He, almost had a wolf-like kind of presence. In great shape. He didn't necessarily look like a bodybuilder, but he looked agile. He looked strong. He looked great from the very beginning. His first scenes at Gibraltar, the Rock of Gibraltar, he's wearing this black tactical outfit, and he looks great in it. I mean, it fits him perfectly, and he's throwing himself into the action from the very beginning. And turns out he liked to do most of his own stunts. And this was at a time before Tom Cruise was doing most of his own stunts, or at least famous for doing most of his own stunts. And oftentimes it was at the chagrin of the director, John Glenn, because the stunt guys would like let Timothy Dalton do some stunts that John Glenn, the director, did not want him to do. It was like too dangerous. So I'm not saying there weren't some stuntmen who did some of the work. Obviously there were, but no. A lot of times when you're watching Timothy Dalton on top of a vehicle or on top of a tanker, and like in License to Kill, for example, or hanging from a helicopter, that's him, and you can see that's him. So it should come as no surprise that these are my two favorite James Bond films, especially The Living Daylights. He looks great in The Living Daylights. He's tough. He's dangerous. He seems like a killer, but at the same time, weirdly, he also seems more romantic. Like the chemistry he has with Mariam Dabo, the leading lady in the film, really works. Like it seems like they really do have feelings for each other, whereas in other Bond films, even when he's at his most romantic, it doesn't really seem like he has any real love for these ladies. And that's the other thing. This is no slam on the other actors playing Bond, but they strike me as more sociopathic. I'm excluding Daniel Craig here, but I'll exclude also Lazenby, because he only had the one movie, and he is able to be emotional at the end of On Her Majesty's Secret Service. So I'll exclude him too. But the most famous Bonds, Connery, Roger Moore, and Pierce Brosnan, suave, charming, sometimes cheeky. They seem very sociopathic as Bond. These are Bonds who don't have any friends. The romances they have in these movies never feel like it's a two-way thing. It feels like, he finds them attractive. He finds these ladies attractive, certainly willing to bed them. And he's even willing to protect them, but there's no feeling. Like, he doesn't love these ladies. And honestly, maybe that's more accurate for a spy, especially one like James Bond, who's as successful as he is. Maybe he's supposed to be sociopathic. Just for me, it doesn't make it all that enjoyable if Bond is too sociopathic. In the case of Daniel Craig, I don't think Craig's Bond is sociopathic, but I think Craig's Bond wants to be sociopathic. That's the interesting thing about Daniel Craig, is I feel like his James Bond does have feelings, particularly for Vespa and the other lady whose name escapes me, but later in his series. But he seemed, because of what happens with Vespa, I think he spends the rest of the series wanting to protect his heart, and he aspires to be sociopathic, but unfortunately he can't be. So that's an interesting take on Bond. But to me, and as far as Lazenby on Her Majesty's Secret Service, most of the film he kind of feels sociopathic too. I don't know. It's weird. He's an interesting take on Bond. We only have one movie that we can judge him on, and I base him not really being sociopathic on just the one scene at the end, essentially. So, but otherwise, kind of hard to really get a handle on his Bond through most of the film. But no doubt about it, as tough as Timothy Dalton's Bond is, as dangerous as he is, and as threatening, and sometimes he can be downright intimidating, he's the maybe the least sociopathic Bond of the entire series because he does have friends. Felix is his friend, as we see, in the beginning of License to Kill, and Felix's new bride. He has seemingly almost a more tender relationship with Q, at least a more camaraderie, I guess, with Q. It feels like there's a little bit of a deeper connection with Q, especially again in License to Kill. And especially in The Living Daylights, again, his relationship with Cara Malovi, played by Mariam Davo. It just feels, something about it feels genuine, feels real. It is the most romantic relationship of any Bond film until we get to, Casino Royale and Bond and Vespa. Dalton portrays Bond more seriously. Yes, it's still fun and there's a few jokes. Nothing wrong with that. Keep it entertaining. But he wanted to be closer to the novel, to the vision of Ian Fleming, who wrote the novels, and so his Bond is less tongue-in-cheek, more serious, more interested in the action, and instead of just flirtation with the women, a little bit more serious with the women. And for me, it really worked. This is the James Bond I wanted to see. As I say, no Bond film is perfect. The Living Daylights is my favorite, but even it has moments here and there where it drags a little bit. It feels pretty long at times. That it goes all the way to Afghanistan. And just when I think the Afghanistan scenes are unnecessary and almost decide that they're boring, then we have a huge action sequence that's one of the best action sequences of any Bond film. Especially, there's a fight in the air where Bond and the henchmen are fighting each other while hanging on this cargo net, and it is one of the greatest fight scenes, one of the greatest climactic scenes of any Bond film. And there's no green screen. It's a combination of real stunt guys, actually flying in midair, fighting or play fighting, and close-ups of the real actors actually hanging on a net in a studio somewhere, not using green screen, but using like models, and it's all practical effects. So that's why it looks so great, and it has you on the edge of your seat. So it's fantastic. It's romantic, The Living Daylights. It's one of those great globe-trotting international James Bond movies. Sort of a classic traditional, and that's why it's my favorite. But the next one, License to Kill, is my second favorite because it's, for almost the opposite reasons. It's one of the few incredibly unique Bond films because this time it's more personal. It's a vendetta. And the whole movie is about a vendetta from Bond because two of his close friends have been attacked, and he seeks vengeance. And instead of it being globe-trotting, it all pretty much takes place in one area, I think the Florida Keys somewhere. And the villain, instead of somebody who wants to take over the world, it's more of a real-life villain. He's a drug lord played by Robert Davi. Yeah, he plays a drug lord. He's fantastic as the bad guy. There's a very young Benicio del Toro who plays his henchman, and a whole sort of cadre of interesting villains in this movie. And it's kind of a fun, sort of tight revenge thriller. And the actresses who are the sort of the love interests, the Bond girls, if you will, they're beautiful. But they were kind of models at the time, and this is if either their first film or one of their first films, and they weren't necessarily the most highly trained actresses. They would become quite good actresses, later in their careers. Talisa Soto and Carrie Lowell. But in this movie, the lack of experience kind of shows a little bit. But they still do a good enough job. Carrie Lowell does a good job of being a tough, sort of federal agent who helps Bond. And Talisa Soto is very interesting because whatever limitations she had at the time as an actress, you still felt compelled to sympathize with her. There's a vulnerability that she brought to the role, and you really feel for her situation to the point where I actually was a little bit torn. I'm like, if I'm Bond, I don't really know which lady I would prefer to kind of end up with. I might have ended up with Talisa Soto, but I get why he would end up, with Carrie Lowell instead. But like I say, I thought Living Daylights very well written. Drags a little bit here and there, but not as much as some of the other Bond films too. License to Kill. This movie was made at a time when there was a writer's strike, and so a lot of the film was written by real writers who, before the strike, and then some of it had to be filled in by a couple of other people, including a producer, when there was a writer's strike. So you can kind of tell some of the dialogue maybe not as great, and this might be why some of the acting, especially by the less experienced actresses, why maybe it wasn't so great, because some of the dialogue wasn't up to par, with say the Living Daylights, for example. But nonetheless, it is such a unique Bond film. The stunt work is fantastic. The climax is great. Both these climaxes in Living Daylights and License to Kill, not really like any climax you've seen in any of the other Bond films. Just when you think in License to Kill, it's going to end up with another explosive-filled layer, climax. It doesn't. It leaves the lair, the villain's lair, and the climax really happens on the road with these tankers, and it's awesome. Real stunt work. You got Timothy Dalton fighting with, bad guy, and it's great. Lots of explosions, and we're talking real explosions. Today with CGI, you might think you're watching, some cool explosions, on whatever the next Marvel movie is, but you watch this movie, License to Kill, and you're going to be reminded what real explosions look like in a real film. So, I said it before. Timothy Dalton took his Bond seriously, wanted a tougher Bond, wanted a more serious Bond, wanted a more romantic Bond, and guess what? The films followed suit. The films are more serious. Yes, they're fun. Yes, they have some great one-liners here and there, but they're tougher films. They're darker films. And they're films that, while they were hits when they were released, they weren't huge hits. And audiences didn't really know how to feel about this particular new Bond. And critics didn't quite know how they wanted to feel, because it's like they missed the cheeky quality of it. So Pierce Brosnan takes over. And those of us who remember Remington Steele, yeah, we could see Pierce Brosnan as Bond, but unfortunately to me, I could only see him as a Roger Moore-like Bond. And that's exactly what he was. And that's kind of the problem for me with Pierce Brosnan. He offered nothing new as Bond. People wanted him to play Bond because they knew how he would be as Bond. He would be charming, he would be cheeky, he would be funny, he would be suave. And that's all things that really both Sean Connery and Roger Moore were. And that adds absolutely nothing new. Connery was the first Bond, so of course he was new. Roger Moore added something new. George Lazenby, again, hard to say. He only had one movie, but Timothy Dalton offered something new, and now you bring in Pierce Brosnan, who's charming, and he's suave, and he's handsome, but that's not new to Bond. There's literally nothing new he brought to James Bond. Yeah, he doesn't, not only does he not offer anything new, but because he's more Roger Moore like, the films become a lot more like the Roger Moore movies. And the more Bond films Brosnan makes, the kind of sillier they become, to the point where his very last movie, Die Another Day, is one of the silliest, dumbest Bond films of all time. The dialogue is horrifically bad, especially between he and Halle Berry. The flirtation dialogue is awful. I mean, there's a difference between cheeky but kind of clever and then just terrible. I mean, and the dialogue is terrible. You have the invisible car. And I'm sorry, if Bond can have an invisible car, he can just run over bad guys and then that's the end of the movie. It makes no sense. And then you have the bad special effects. We've seen green screen special effects from Bond and, probably some CGI, in future Bonds. But even the green screen effects that look bad now, at the time in the 80s, especially the Roger Moore movies, they probably looked good back then. The special effects, the CGI in Die Another Day, didn't look good at the time. I mean, they just looked awful. And so this is what the Bond series became with Pierce Brosnan. Now, there are a couple of other Brosnan Bond films that tried to take itself seriously, but it kind of really couldn't. I said before, these films take on the persona of whoever's playing Bond. Brosnan was handsome and charming and charismatic, but empty as Bond. Offered absolutely nothing new. And his movies were charming and looked pretty good, but empty. And his Bond films offered nothing new. Now, we go to Daniel Craig, and already just the casting of Daniel Craig, something's new here because we've never seen a blonde Bond before. And but he was really good. Casino Royale is absolutely one of the best James Bond movies. I would rank it top 3, 4, something like that. Probably my third favorite Bond film. It was great action. Everything's well filmed. I did love the romantic chemistry between he and Eva Green. And like a lot of other Bonds, it also goes a bit too long. There are moments for me that dragged, but yeah, really good movie. And believe it or not, I'm a fan of Quantum of Solace. It really feels like a part 2 to Casino Royale. I know a lot of people had a problem with some of the quick edits, especially during fight scenes, stuff like that, or action scenes. I didn't really have too big a problem with that. I mean, I'd made it through all the Bourne films, for goodness sakes. But I like Quantum of Solace. It's a little bit different. And after you've seen so many Bond films, you really appreciate the Bond films that are different than all the other ones. Like License to Kill. Believe it or not, License to Kill was not among my favorites at the time it was released in 1989. Because I was always more of a traditionalist. But as the years have gone on, especially after the Pierce Brosnan movies, I really reassessed License to Kill and appreciate the fact that it is so different than all the other Bond films now. Well, that's the case with Quantum of Solace. It's also a little bit more personal for Bond, and it's short. It's a short Bond. This is one of the few Bond movies that doesn't have any moments to me where it drags. It's less than 2 hours, which is highly unusual for a Bond film. And he beds 1 or 2 ladies, but the main Bond girl in the film he never beds. Olga Kurylenko, I think is her name. And she's great. She has her own personal reasons for being involved in the story, and it's an interesting relationship between her and Bond. And I guess they didn't really have any romance because he's still kind of trying to get over Vespa. But I liked it. It's a very tight, action-packed, for me, very fun Bond film. Then we have Skyfall. I hate Skyfall. I loathe Skyfall. Started out loving it. The way the movie began, for the most part, um, I was one of those that was like, this might be the greatest Bond movie I've ever seen. We even meet this, I think, very intriguing Bond girl, but she's an interesting character, a tragic character, and the way the movie makes us kind of sympathize with her. And then the way they just dispose of her, the disrespect that they give to this character, really, it really turned me off. I mean, it turned me way off. Like, Bond girls have died in Bond films before, but it was always treated with some degree of respect. And the way this Bond girl's demise happens, and the way it's treated by both Bond and the film, is reprehensible. And I can't believe all the people who just forget about it. It's all right. They just gloss right over it like it's nothing. I'm dumbfounded by it. I can't believe it. And it doesn't help that everything that kind of happens after that is pretty pedestrian. Like, everything up to that point was so good, and then everything after it is very standard Bond. The finale ends up basically being in his old house, his old mansion, Skyfall, the Skyfall Ranch or whatever the hell it's called. And it just ends up being kind of a standoff between Bond and, M and some other guy, played by Albert Finney. And, the bad guys are trying to get in, and, it's kind of a straw dogs type situation, only straw dogs handled it way better. Or you remember L.A. Confidential and the big climax that happens at the motel. It's kind of like that, only all those other movies did it better. And then that somehow leads into this old church, and then somehow, Bond throws the knife into the back of the bad guy, and it's never been established anywhere in this movie that Bond can throw knives really well. There's a lot I don't like about this movie. It is my least favorite Bond film because it had so much promise, and then everything else after that sucked. And I feel like critics and fans are willing to forgive everything that happens in especially in the third act, and they're willing to forgive how pedestrian the third act is, all because the first half was really cool looking and had a lot of interesting shots, beautifully photographed or nonsense. It's not a good movie. It never has been a good movie. I think time has proven that Casino Royale is still the better film, although some people will still swear by Skyfall, but it's terrible. And then I don't know what to tell you about the final two Bond films, but there's just something different about that. For whatever reason, the Bond writers and producers just decided to make it all connected together into almost one story, one long-running storyline. And it no longer felt like a Bond film. Like, Bond films are supposed to be episodic. They're not really supposed to be related to each other. And these Bond films kind of became related to each other. They introduced Blofeld to us, and then they tried to make it more personal, and that Blofeld is somehow related to James Bond. And I'm like, what? What is this? And Blofeld, despite being played by an Oscar-winning actor, just completely unmemorable in the two films. And even the look of those two films is weird. It's kind of it loses, there's not much color saturation. It looks very flat and gray, and a it's a series that started off so promisingly with Daniel Craig. I mean, I was legitimately with Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace. I was legitimately wondering if Daniel Craig was going to be my favorite Bond, even over Timothy Dalton. But you follow that up with three movies that were very disappointing to me, and I no longer have to wonder about that. It's not really his fault either. He was a fine James Bond, certainly my second favorite James Bond, um, but it's just disappointing. It's a series that started off so promisingly to me, and then they just had other ideas for how they wanted to handle Bond. And I don't think it's Amazon or Prime or whatever that has killed Bond. I think it was the people behind these Daniel Craig films that killed it, which is a shame. Now, going back to these two movies and to Timothy Dalton, there was a time I used to be sad that Dalton only had two films because he deserved more. And I still feel like he deserved more than that. Rather than making more after License to Kill, I think it would have been more appropriate if he had started even earlier, like maybe around For Your Eyes Only. I think that would have been a great movie for him to start with, and so on. But truth is, he didn't really want to play Bond until they asked him again in 1986 or 87. They approached him way back in the late 60s, I think, for On Her Majesty's Secret Service, to potentially play Bond, but he thought he was too young to play Bond back in those days. So Cubby Broccoli, the main producer guy behind the series, he had been wanting Timothy Dalton for years. So finally he got him for Living Daylights. But Dalton could have played him earlier. And that's Dalton's fault for not, But anyway, as much as he deserves to have played Bond more than twice, the fact is he did everything he needed to do in just two movies. I mean, think about it. The first movie is a traditional Bond film, globe-trotting, romantic, very high on espionage, great stunts, all of that. A great traditional Bond film. And his second Bond film and last Bond film, very untraditional, personal, vendetta, all taking place kind of in one area. You've got a kind of a real world bad guy, not a, fictional fantasy bad guy. And it's violent, very violent, really, for a PG-13 movie, and dark, and by the end of the movie, he looks all bloodied and beat up. A Bond unlike you've ever seen until that point. And what more could one actor really do as James Bond than what Timothy Dalton does in both those? In many ways, it's kind of the perfect situation. All right, I'll play Bond. I'm going to play a traditional Bond, and then I'm going to play an untraditional Bond. And there's literally nothing more Timothy Dalton could have done in any more movies. You would have just had more of the same. Maybe that's a problem with a lot of these other James Bond movies, is maybe the actors go on a little too long as Bond. And maybe there comes a point where it's like, well, what more can we do? Anyway, those are my thoughts on Bond. But the truth is, I think Bond is kind of dead now. I mean, maybe they'll revive him, and maybe it'll be a brand new series, and maybe maybe they'll inject something new and energetic to a new series of Bond films. But I feel like James Bond, as we know it, is over. And while part of me feels sad about that, I guess part of me also feels like maybe it's time.